someone who genuinely cares about you and someone who needs you to need them, those two people can look identical for a long time. And that's not a small thing to sit with. Because if you've spent months, maybe years, feeling quietly grateful for someone's presence, feeling like they were the one person who really got you, the possibility that something underneath all of that was never quite what it seemed doesn't just feel confusing. It feels like a betrayal of your own perception, like you have to go back and re-examine things you already made peace with. That's a particular kind of exhaustion that doesn't have a clean name. It's not the exhaustion of conflict. It's not the sharp sting of an obvious falling out. It's something slower than that. A tiredness that accumulates in the body like weather. You find yourself explaining yourself more than you used to. Second-guessing things you said 3 days ago, replaying conversations, not because something went wrong exactly, but because something felt slightly off and you can't locate where. You tell yourself you're overthinking it. You probably are, you think, and then you think it again the next night. There's something about a certain kind of friendship that makes you feel strangely alone precisely when it should feel like connection. You're in the same room, sharing a meal or a screen or a long drive, and there's warmth there. You don't want to minimize that. But underneath the warmth, there's this low, almost inaudible frequency of tension, like you're performing a version of yourself that this person has approved of, and somewhere along the way, you stopped noticing you were doing it. You drift from yourself in slow increments. That's the thing people don't talk about enough. It doesn't happen in a single moment where you look up and don't recognize your life. It happens in 100 tiny adjustments you made to keep the peace, to avoid a certain look, to not be too much in one moment or not enough in another. And you made those adjustments willingly, even lovingly, because you told yourself that's what closeness requires. That's what caring for someone looks like. But there's a question that starts to surface, usually late at night when the day has quieted down and you're left alone with the honest version of your thoughts. The question isn't, do they care about me? You might not even doubt that. The question is quieter and stranger than that. It sounds something like, why do I always feel smaller after we talk? Not hurt, not angry, just smaller. Like something has been very gently, very invisibly compressed. Most people dismiss that question immediately. It feels ungrateful to hold it. It feels like an accusation against someone who has probably never done a single thing you could point to and call wrong. That's part of what makes this so disorienting. The absence of evidence is itself a kind of trap. You can't justify your own unease, so you turn it inward. You wonder what's wrong with you, why you can't just receive care without analyzing it, why you always have to complicate things. That self-questioning is worth pausing on, because there's a specific pattern underneath it, a psychological dynamic that operates almost entirely below the surface of awareness, both for the person experiencing it and, in many cases, for the person causing it. It doesn't require cruelty. It doesn't require intention. In some ways, that's precisely what makes it so difficult to name. In the next part, we'll start to look at what that dynamic actually is, what it does to your sense of self over time, and why the people who carry it out are often the last ones you'd ever think to question. If this content speaks the words you can't explain, click subscribe. Thank you for your support. At some point, you stop noticing the adjustments you make. That's the part that's hard to explain to someone who hasn't felt it. It's not like you made a conscious decision to become quieter around this person, or to edit your opinions before you spoke them, or to feel a faint rehearsal happening in your chest before certain conversations. It just became the texture of the relationship. Normal. Background. Like the hum of an air conditioner you stopped hearing 6 months ago, but that's been running the whole time, and you're still functioning perfectly well on the outside. That's what makes it strange. You're showing up, you're present, you're even laughing at the right moments, but there's a part of you that's watching all of this from a slight distance, like you split at some point, one version of you engaging and another version standing just behind that, quiet, waiting, not entirely sure what it's waiting for. Identity doesn't collapse dramatically. That's a thing people get wrong about it. It softens, gradually, imperceptibly. You start to hold opinions more loosely around certain people, not because you've genuinely reconsidered them, but because the energy required to defend them quietly stopped feeling worth it. You find yourself agreeing more, qualifying your feelings with, maybe I'm wrong, when you're not actually uncertain, when you never were. And after a while, it becomes genuinely difficult to locate where their version of you ends and where you actually begin. You can't remember when you last said something that felt entirely unfiltered around them. There's a specific moment, and a lot of people have had it without ever giving it a name, where you're in the middle of telling a story, something that matters to you, and you catch something in the other person's expression, or in their posture, or in the timing of a silence, and something in you quietly changes course mid-sentence. You steer toward a safer ending. You flatten the part of the story that felt most true, and you do it so smoothly, so automatically, that by the time the conversation moves on, you've almost convinced yourself that was what you meant to say anyway. What stays with you isn't the moment itself. It's the strange absence after it. A kind of emotional aftertaste you can't quite describe. You go home and you sit with it. Not with grief, exactly. Not with anger. Something more like displacement. Like you were somewhere, and now you're not sure where you are. And the unsettling part is that you can't point to a single thing that happened to make you feel that way. Emotional over-adaptation has this quality where it teaches you to distrust your own comfort. Because you've been comfortable and still felt wrong. You felt cared for and still felt unseen. And when those two things coexist long enough, you stop using your internal sense of ease as a reliable signal. You start questioning it instead. You override it the way you'd override hunger when you're too busy. Just push it down, keep moving, assume it'll pass. What you don't fully notice yet is how this changes the way you move through other parts of your life too. The habit doesn't stay in one relationship. It travels. It starts to inform how you hold yourself in rooms where the dynamic doesn't even require it. How you pause before speaking in situations where there's no reason to pause. How you've started treating your own instincts like something that needs to be verified before it can be trusted. And that's the part worth sitting with, because it points towards something underneath the surface of the friendship itself. Something that isn't just about your habits or your sensitivity or how you were wired. There may be a reason this particular dynamic produces this particular erosion, a psychological mechanism that runs quietly in the background, shaping things you never agreed to have shaped. That's where we're going next. Here's what starts to become visible when you look a little closer. The adjustments you made, the smoothing over, the quiet steering away from your own truth mid-sentence, none of that was weakness. It was learned. At some point, staying small in the presence of certain people felt safer than staying whole. And when something feels safer long enough, you stop experiencing it as a choice. It becomes reflex. It becomes, eventually, something that feels like personality. That's the uncomfortable part. Because you've probably explained these habits to yourself using words like easygoing or low maintenance or not someone who makes things difficult. And there's real pride in that self-image. A quiet sense of virtue in being the person who doesn't ask for too much, who keeps the peace, who doesn't place their needs at the center of things. But somewhere underneath that pride, if you're honest, there's something else. A fear that has never fully been examined. The fear that if you stopped adapting, if you showed up as the unedited version of yourself, the relationship wouldn't survive it. That fear is doing more work than most people realize. It's not just shaping how you behave around one person. It's shaping what you believe you're allowed to be, period. Because once you internalize the idea that your full self is somehow too much or too difficult or requires more justification than it's worth, you don't keep that belief neatly contained to one relationship. You carry it. You begin to pre-edit yourself in new situations, with new people, in moments that have no history and no actual reason for caution. The fear travels ahead of you and rearranges things before you even arrive. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from living slightly behind yourself. Not the tiredness of doing too much, more like the tiredness of constant low-level surveillance. Monitoring your own expression, the temperature of your voice, how much space you're taking up emotionally in a given moment. Most people who do this have no idea how much energy it consumes because they've never known what it would feel like to stop. The baseline has always included this. It's like asking someone what it would feel like to stop carrying something they were handed before they could walk. And here's where something quietly painful surfaces. The people who require the most adaptation from you rarely announce that requirement. It doesn't come through criticism or obvious control. It comes through something subtler, through the way they respond when you don't adapt. A shift in warmth, a certain withdrawal, a version of their presence that becomes slightly less available when you take up more space than they're comfortable with. And you felt that. Your nervous system registered every single one of those micro-signals, even when your conscious mind explained them away as coincidence or your own sensitivity. You adjusted, not because you were told to, because somewhere in you, you understood what was being communicated without it ever needing to be said. That understanding is worth sitting with because it reveals something that has very little to do with the other person and everything to do with you. Not in a way that assigns blame, but in a way that asks, when did you first learn that your presence needed to be managed before it could be offered? When did full honesty start feeling like a risk rather than a baseline? These aren't questions about this friendship. They're older than this friendship. And that's the place this is really leading toward, because the patterns you've been living inside didn't form in a vacuum, and they don't exist in isolation. There's a shape to them. And when you start to see that shape clearly, the way you understand yourself and the relationships you've been drawn to begins to shift in ways that are quiet but not small. Something shifts when you stop trying to figure out what's wrong with you and start getting curious about what happened to you instead. Not as a reframe, not as something comforting to tell yourself, just as a more accurate question. Because the habits that have been creating friction in your relationships, the over-adaptation, the pre-editing, the way you've learned to manage your own presence before offering it, those didn't come from a character flaw. They came from somewhere. They were responses once. Reasonable ones, probably. The problem is that responses which outlive their original context don't disappear. They just keep firing indiscriminately in situations that no longer require them. Seeing that clearly for the first time doesn't feel like relief. It feels more like a strange, quiet stillness. Like something you've been arguing against for a long time has stopped requiring an argument. You were doing what you understood survival to look like in the emotional environment you were navigating. That's not a noble realization or a forgiving one. It's just true. And truth, when it finally comes without agenda, has a particular texture. It doesn't rush toward a conclusion. It just sits there and waits for you to keep looking. What you start to notice when you look is how much of your emotional life has been organized around anticipation. Not fear exactly, but a kind of readiness. A low, constant readiness for the moment when being yourself becomes a problem for someone. You became very good at sensing that moment before it arrived, at softening things preemptively, at offering a version of yourself that was slightly less likely to create friction. And because that readiness was always operating, you've spent very little time inside relationships, including your relationship with yourself, without it. Unguarded is not a state you access easily. You've probably mistaken that for being a private person or an introspective one. But there's a difference between choosing solitude and not knowing how to exist without the buffer. The cost of that becomes clearer now, too. Not in the obvious ways, not in the ruptures and the arguments, but in the quieter losses. The version of a friendship that never fully formed because you never fully showed up for it. The conversations that stayed shallow, not because there was nothing deeper, but because something in you kept redirecting away from it. The moments you could have been genuinely known by someone and chose, without consciously choosing, the performance instead. Those losses don't announce themselves. They accumulate as a kind of ambient grief you can't quite source. A feeling that your relationships are slightly thinner than they should be, that something essential keeps not quite landing. What changes when you see the pattern isn't the pattern. Not immediately. The habits don't dissolve because you've identified them. You'll still feel the reflex. You'll still sometimes steer mid-sentence. Still sometimes hear yourself agreeing when you don't agree. Still sometimes leave a conversation feeling like you left something important unsaid. The difference is that you'll notice it now, and noticing is its own kind of disruption. Not dramatic, not transformative overnight. But the moment you can observe a habit from the outside, it loses the invisibility it needed to keep running unchallenged. There's something slightly disorienting about this kind of clarity, because it doesn't resolve anything neatly. You see the pattern, you understand something of where it came from, and the relationships it has shaped are still there, still complicated, still requiring you to figure out how to exist inside them differently without a clear script for how to do that. The map doesn't come with the territory. You just see the terrain more honestly now. And that's not a small thing, even when it doesn't feel like enough. Some people live their entire lives inside these patterns without ever stepping back far enough to see their outline. You're already somewhere past that. What you do with that visibility, how slowly or quickly you let it inform the choices ahead. That part is still open, still being written. Does any of this feel familiar to you? I'd genuinely like to know. Tell me in the comments which part of this stayed with you the most.